So I made a decision that about a year before I met the FBI, myself and 3 other executives that were also convicted in this case, and it was really hard because these guys were my best friends, and one of them went to prison because of me. But me and 3 other executives that were not above me, these people were my level and below me in my division, we lost $600,000 on an investment. This was a year before I met the FBI. And we reimbursed ourselves because we knew about the price fixing. We know the company couldn't do anything to us. So we stole $600 and reimbursed ourselves on this investment. It was Sid Haas, you may remember some of the movie, Reinhard Richter, Marty Allison. All 3 of them were convicted. One of them went to prison for that $600,000 crime that we split among the 4 of us. So when I'm out on this driveway at 3 in the morning, I knew how to take money from ADM. The accountants were scared to death of me. They were never going to challenge me. And then I thought, well, if I kind of do that same thing, but just for me, without my colleagues, but a lot bigger. I was thinking about 3 years of my salary. It'd take me about 3 years to get back on my feet. I already knew how to take money from ADM. I knew how to have a bogus invoice, put it through the system. I knew the company couldn't come and say, hey, Mark, we're going to go after you for embezzlement. How could they go after me for embezzlement when they're stealing $1 billion a year, the 3 people I worked for? Their crime was so big that I was protected for this level that I was talking about. So I made the decision, 3 years of my compensation was about $9.5 million, that I'm going to write $9.5 million to myself the same way we did the $600,000, myself and 3 colleagues, bogus invoices through the system. So that next day I started putting some invoices in. I did 5 invoices in total, $9.5 million. Accountants were scared to death of me. They sure were going to challenge me. I knew if the company came to me, as I mentioned earlier, how can they go after me for $9.5 million when they're stealing $1 billion a year for 14 years in a row? I was the most protected man in America. So I wrote $9.5 million. I said, now when I get fired, I've got 3 years of what I'm used to making, what I deserve, what I earn, I felt at the time. That sense of entitlement attitude that I had. I felt like I had 3 years to get back on my feet. Well, I wasn't thinking very clearly. Because I got a call, when ADM learned I was the informant, I got a call from an accountant. It's in the book, The Informant, where I discuss this in detail. A friend of mine who was really close to me. He called me, his name's Lou Rochelle, and he said, Mark, ADM's going after you for embezzlement. And he said, they're pulling invoices right now and they're going to go after you for $9.5 million embezzlement that you stole from them. He said, I'm just letting you know I'm a friend. He said, they're going to go public with it soon. They're going to tell the FBI. They're going to tell the media. So I met the FBI agents. I wanted to be the first to tell them. I met them in a Chinese restaurant the next day. I set up a meeting. Said, I got some things to tell you guys. And I tell you what, it was hard after working with them for 3 years. They became my friends. I couldn't imagine how I'm going to tell them I took $9.5 million the same time I'm working for them. So I started off saying, well, what would happen when people take home company pencils? What would happen when you use the corporate jet for personal use? What would happen if I drive my Mercedes to work, but my company car I let my daughter drive? Because I just couldn't get it out. And then I started telling them about the money. And I tell you what, I saw some jaws drop. Because then they knew they had a challenge and they knew they had a problem. You know, they came to my house, they went and talked about that among themselves and called their superiors. They came to my house shortly after that and said, Mark, we're going to do everything we can. We know you've been cracking under the pressure. Ginger's been telling us about you blowing the driveway off with gas leaf blowers at 3 in the morning and so on. By the way, the FBI has a guideline now, and partly because of my case initiated that discussion. They do not allow an informant to wear a wire longer than a year because they saw the meltdown of someone that went through wearing one for 3. So guidelines were changed as a result of my case. So they were sympathetic. They said, Mark, you're no longer going to have full immunity because of this theft, but we're going to do everything we can to get you the best deal we can. You know, they went to the prosecutors and they told the prosecutors this, tried to get me a plea deal. They said, Mark Whitacre stole $9.5 million at a time that his mental stability is at its worst. He said, Mark Whitacre never got to see mental health counseling, a psychiatrist. When FBI agents go undercover, they have to see a psychiatrist every 3 months to help them deal with a double life. They said Mark, being a civilian, never got to see any kind of mental health counseling. Psychologist, psychiatrist, neither one. So he said, we need to do something for him. Well, the prosecutor said this, well, we can't give him full immunity because it's in the news now that he stole $9.5 million. We have to punish him. But we'll give him the best deal we can give him. And you know, they agreed to a 6-month sentence. Prison camp, no fence, white collar camp, 6 months and I'm home. My lawyer called my wife and I to Chicago to meet with him. Said, Mark, the FBI agents fought for you. Got you a deal of a lifetime. A plea deal that you're 6 months in prison. You go in early 1998. You'll be home by mid-98. You'll be home about when your middle son graduates from high school. You got to take this. It's a deal of a lifetime. You got 48 hours to sign it. But he said it also requires, now that you had the fraud, to be a better witness, you also have to plead to price fixing. To plea out as a defendant on price fixing, that I no longer had the immunity for price fixing. I could not imagine, after wearing a wire for 3 years, to pleading out on price fixing. I was the one who wore a wire. I was the one who exposed that case. I was the one who told the FBI, because of my wife from the begin with, that price fixing was happening. I would not accept pleading out on price fixing. I took that plea deal, threw it in a trash can, fired that lawyer, hired a whole group of lawyers the next day, and fought that case with everything I had. Sold my house, sold my cars to get money, the money that I needed to pay legal fees, and I fought that case for 2 years, everything I had. And I got a 10-year sentence instead. And I had a 6-month sentence just by signing a piece of paper that I threw in a trash can. I ended up with a 10-year federal prison. Because when you fight a case and the government has to spend millions of dollars in prosecuting you, it's a whole different sentencing structure than a plea deal. But what I want to talk about today is beyond the movie. I went to prison in 1998. That's almost 16 years ago. That was March of 1998. It'll be 16 years next month. Did life end then? I want to talk about the rest of the story and what's happened since then. That's been published in the book called Against All Odds, which is mostly about my wife. That came out in 2010, about how we survived this ordeal. Well, now that I had a 10-year sentence and no longer 6 months, because I threw it in a trash can, I pulled my car in one of my garages, I let it run, and I tried to take my own life. I had letters written to my parents, letters written to my wife, letters written to my kids. I gave up all hope. I saw where the divorce rate was 99%, so I said I'm not even going to have a family when I get out anyway, with the divorce rate being 99%. And I said I'm not going to be employable coming out convicted felon 10 years later, so I tried to kill myself. I couldn't imagine living. Gave up all hope. Someone read about that in the newspaper. This would have been in fall of '97. A guy named Ian Howes. Ian Howes showed up at my house, a stranger, I didn't know him. Showed up at my house. I was hospitalized for a month. I was treated for post-traumatic stress syndrome. I was treated for bipolar disorder. All the things that happen when you wear a wire for 3 years and you get to the point where you just try to kill yourself. I was hospitalized for a month. And he read about that in the newspaper, where I tried to take my own life, how I threw a 6-month deal in a trash can, how I'm now getting a 10-year sentence, all the things that I just described to you thus far, front page of the newspapers. He read about it, looked up, found out where I lived, showed up at my house, and he said, Mark, prison's going to be the beginning of your life, not the end. You're going to find your true purpose in life. He was a member of a group called CBMC, Christian Businessmen Connection. I never heard of him or this group at that time. This is fall of 1997. I came back in my house and told my wife, I said, this guy just said this is the beginning of my life. Honey, he's crazier than I am. Get him out of here. She said, you know what? Maybe you ought to listen to him. He told me, he said, Mark, if I spend some time with him each week, he had a study called Operation Timothy. It's an introduction to the Bible. He said, if I spend a little time with him each week, that I may find that there's a lot of good that come out of all this mess that I found myself in, that I caused myself in, not just found, that I caused myself. So I said, yeah, I'd go through it with him. I said, how long does it take? He said, I usually like to take about an hour a week for a couple of years. I said, I have to show up in prison in 7 months for a decade. I've got 7 months to get my house in order. He said, well, I need to spend 5 or 6 hours a week with you. This is a man that was CFO of a pharmaceutical company, CFO, a man that had 5 children, all school age and younger. You know he didn't have time to be spending 5 or 7 hours a week with me, 5 to 7. He showed up at my house 5 to 7 hours each week, went through Operation Timothy with me, and he planted a seed that changed my life forever. First thing we talked about was, I told him, I said, I think my sins are too big for God to ever forgive me. He'd show me in Scripture that there's no sin that's too big for God to forgive you. And then I said, well, why would God forgive me? And he showed me in Scripture how Jesus came and died here on earth on the cross for my sins. And this was something I'm talking about in a minute. We'd spend hours on. And I tell you, he planted a seed that changed my life forever. Because this man, his name is Chuck Colson, he touched millions of lives. He saw a lot of similarities in my case as he did his case. I was addicted to greed. He was addicted to power at the White House. He went to Brown University. I went to Cornell. We both went to Ivy League. We both went to prison. We were both at the top of our game and ended up in prison. We both were on the front page of lots of newspapers around the country and around the world. So he saw a lot of similarities in our lives. And so instead of sending a volunteer to talk with me, he wanted to talk to me himself. And he reached out and he mentored me for 9 years in prison. And I tell you, he watered the seed that Ian House planted. And I tell you, they impacted my life greatly. When you look at 2 Corinthians 5:20, and it says, if you are a believer in Jesus Christ, you are an ambassador. 2 Corinthians 5:20 says that. You are an ambassador if you are a believer. The question is, how effective are you? Well, I want to tell you something. In my lifetime, I've seen 2 ambassadors face to face. And that was Ian House and Chuck Colson. I saw them face to face sacrifice their life for others. And I had 9 years of free time. All I had to do is show up for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. 9 years of free time. It's like 50 years of real life. No computer, no email, no cell phone. I was in a 10 by 10 in a locker, concrete floor for 9 years. Age 41 to age 49. There's no parole in the federal system. You have to do 8.5 years on a 10-year sentence. You get 15% off on good behavior. So I do 8.5 years. And I tell you, those 8.5 years is like 50 years of real life. And I tell you what, I thank God for the Bible. Because I read that Bible, Genesis to Revelation, all the way through every year. And my relationship with God kept growing and kept growing and kept growing. And I went to church my whole life. My parents forced me to go to church as a youngster. I went to church with my wife and kids because I thought it was the right thing to do. But at age 41, my 3rd month in prison after Ian Howes and meeting Chuck Colson, my 3rd month in prison, them planting that seed, I turned my life over to Christ and got on my knees and surrendered my life to Jesus Christ. Even though I went to church my whole life, at age 41 is when I really became a believer and a follower of Jesus Christ. I found there's a huge difference between going to church and being a follower. One's in the head and the other one's in the heart. And I finally had him in my heart in June of 1998 at age 41. And for the first time in my life at June of 98, and I had 8.5 years of prison yet ahead of me. This was only my 3rd month. I wasn't getting out till December of 06. The first time in my life, I felt peace and contentment that I never felt in my life. God then touched the hearts after He redeemed me. He touched the hearts of society. My wife, in the book Against All Odds, Mark Whitacre Against All Odds, they added her days up from the records where she visited me in prison, and it added up to 3 years and 8 months that she sat 8 hours a day in federal prison. They allow on Friday nights and Saturday and Sunday for your family to come into federal prison to visit you in a visiting room setting. My wife moved to 3 different states, lived next to those 3 different prisons, and she visited the 20 hours allowable weekend that she was allowed with my children for 9 years. For 8 years and 8 months. She never missed. When I got moved from Yazoo, Mississippi to Edgefield, South Carolina, the next week she lived there. When I got moved from Edgefield, South Carolina to Pensacola, Florida, the next week she lived there. She moved to wherever I was. My wife went to prison with me and my kids with a 99% divorce rate. You can't tell me that's not a miracle of God. The companies I was stealing from, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Kraft, the companies we were stealing from on the price fixing scheme won hundreds of millions of dollars back from ADM and class action suits. Coca-Cola alone won $400 million back from the theft on the price fixing. They hired a lawyer. There was a Tyson Foods general counsel, talked to the other plaintiffs who won also money back, and he had 11 of them on a phone call, and he said, you know what? I don't know the Whitacres. I've never met them. But if it wasn't for Ginger Whitacre, price fixing would still be going on today just like it did for 14 years. And if it wasn't for Mark Whitacre who wore a wire and exposed this case, it'd still be going on today. My wife at that time was about ready to move back in her home with my 3 children, with her parents, because I spent everything we had. I paid $9 million back to the government to get 5 years off my sentence. I would have had a 15-year sentence, but if you pay the money back, you get 5 years off. So obviously to get 5 years off, you're going to pay that back. So that's how I got 10-year sentence instead of 15. But then I spent everything else we had on lawyers and legal fees. I sold the house and cars to pay lawyers. I had millions of dollars in legal fees. And those companies called my wife in August of '98. They hired a law firm called Dickstein and Shapiro out of Washington, D.C. A guy named Ken Adams. There's an old chapter of this on the new book. He called my wife and said, Ginger Whitacre, if it wasn't for you, this case would still be going on. And for Mark wearing that wire, it would have never been exposed. And for that, we want to take care of your family for a decade financially. Those companies, those 11 companies that won hundreds of millions of dollars back, put my wife back in college at age 40 to be a teacher. She was Teacher of the Year at Pensacola in 2007. They put my kids through college. My daughter has a master's from Duke. My youngest son has an MBA from Georgia Southern. They paid our house payment, our car payments, our kids' college for 9 years. And those were the people I was stealing from. I thought the media would forget about me 9 years later. And I had 4 offers in biotech and pharmaceutical companies, 4 offers, 24 hours after I got out of 9 years of jail. You can't tell me that's not God touching hearts. I joined one of the companies, this California biotech company, and I head up our cancer research trials, our clinical trials. I joined them the day after I got out. And you don't start off the head of finance when you steal $9.5 million. I want to let you know that. So I started off in research. And you know, 3 years ago, I was promoted to COO and Chief Science Officer. I'm the number 2 in that company, right under the CEO. I am over all the financing now. I rebuilt the trust, the credibility, and you can't tell me that that's not a miracle of God. After everything that happened, that they would give me another chance at my career. This is my family today, my wife and I and our 3 children and our daughter-in-law. Our youngest is married. That's a picture from about October, stronger than ever. And like I said, family stayed with me. The FBI agents forgave me. The companies I stole from took care of my family.